Maureen worked with you. So, um, all right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Hope everyone's having a good night and looking forward to a little break in the second half of this week. It's nice to see you all here. We would like to acknowledge the land on which the University at Buffalo operates, which is the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty of Peace and Friendship, a pledge to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. It is also covered by the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua between the United States government and the Six Nations Confederacy, which further affirmed Haudenosaunee land rights and sovereignty in the state of New York. Today, this region is still the home to the Haudenosaunee people, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory. Tonight, we're very lucky to have Caitlin Cass with us. She is an alum of our program and is coming all the way from Omaha. And we're also extra lucky to have one of our MFA students, Isabel Jansen, introduce her. Caitlin was the pick of our MFA cohort. So please join me in welcoming Isabel. Welcome to the stage.
Hey. Caitlin Cass is a comic and installation artist. She recently published Suffrage Song, The Haunted History of Gender, Race, and Voting Rights in the U.S., which details the complex and often forgotten history of women's suffrage movement. This would eventually win a 2024 Eisner Award for reality-based work. Before this, she actually started at UB in our very own MFA program, where she developed her periodical comic, Great Moments in Western Civilization, Postal Constituent, which she releases 6 times a year, and is also a contributing cartoonist to The New Yorker. She currently teaches at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, where I'm from. Caitlin was my illustration professor at UNO. I tragically met her at the end of my degree and only took 1 class with her, but that 1 class was enough to change me. Through her passion for narrative works in history, I began to explore the idea of the archive and our relationship with it. Caitlin is smart, kind, nurturing, and a breath of fresh air. She believed in my art so much to write my letter of recommendation that it would eventually bring me to Buffalo. I'm always grateful for her, and I'm very happy to introduce her. That's when you come.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. I want to thank Isabel for introducing me and how cool. I also saw a Buffalo Seminary student in the hallway today who's a graphic design student, Katie Pullman, which was really cool because I taught her at high school, and then I have a student from UNO introducing me here. So it just feels really fuzzy to have every people from all over in my life in this one space with me. So thank you very much. I'm starting with this quote from Donna Haraway that I was thinking about a lot when I moved across the country to Omaha from here after living here for 11 years. So it matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what knots, not knots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, what ties tie ties. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories. So this is a quote from her book, Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Cthulhu Scene. So Donna Haraway was a professor in the history of consciousness, and she's an emeritus professor now still. So her work, it deals with a lot of feminist studies, a lot of stuff with technology. She's well known for writing the Cyborg Manifesto. But this book was about like sort of staying with the trouble of climate change and also making kin in unexpected places with non-human populations, collaborating with those populations. But the thing that really stood out to me were these like almost storybook-like phrases, right? Like these sort of rhyming, strange phrases that sort of stuck with you, and you couldn't forget them. So knots, not knots. And so those go through my head a lot, I realized. And what was coming out of that quote too for me is something that I'm thinking about a lot now as I'm doing a second master's degree in history. And that's methodological humility. So this idea that, you can come up with systems of thinking from unlikely sources, from nature, from animals. You can go beyond the sort of typical linear narrative, A to B. You can reinvent academic thinking and use other methods that might be more productive, because it's not like we've really made a whole lot of progress in the history of thought. And so that is something that's really inspiring my work right now. And this is a phrase that is really, I think, making me think deeper about what's at the bottom of what I do. So I have divided this talk into some very basic formal structures that I use in my work. So I'm going to start with grids, then I'm going to talk about circles, and then I'm going to talk about webs. Which I'm trying to work towards more now. So to begin with the grid, the comic grid, of course, is a huge part of my work. And I think the comic grid arguably has its roots in medieval manuscripts. And this is a redrawing of an image from this Livres du Trésor, which is the Book of Treasures. It was an encyclopedia from 1260. And this is a sort of diagram of different career paths you could take, or different fields of study. Everything from up in the right corner, you see necromancy, which is pretty bizarre, to think like a painter down here. Different fields, basically. There's rhetoric and grammar and law represented on here. But what I thought was really intriguing was A, how it's divided as a grid, and then B, how some of the people, like the scribe, are working on what looks like a comic panel to my contemporary eyes, what actually is a wax tablet, which would have been a device to take notes in classes, and was used also internally to structure memory, because at the time there weren't a lot of books, right? So you had to memorize things a lot more. Books were rare. And so you would use the grid to embed text, sort of like you might have heard of these memory palaces, where you might imagine an architecture, and then you could use it to memorize pi by placing each number of pi in a different location physically, and then when you walk through the location you can remember. So they would use these grids, but then eventually at first they would just imagine them, these architectural details, these vivid images, but eventually they made it to the page, starting with canon tables, where each column would look different, so that you could remember the biblical passage that you had memorized as you looked at that column that was very specific. And there would also be these saints that were often the animal version of that saint that would help you remember that image too. And so then you could place it physically, and it was easier to recall it. So of course in this grid, you'll notice how each column has a different pattern. That all facilitated memory. You could put any kind of information on an image like this if you had it in your head. So you could memorize a speech, but you could nestle each bit of the speech in these different categories. And then at the top, there's this imagery of ecclesia, who is the female embodiment of the church. In the medieval era, there were often female embodiments of abstract ideas that sort of drew inspiration from ancient Greek muses, for example. So there's this pretty well-known chart of the 7 liberal arts, which I studied as an undergrad. I went to a school where we studied the great books. It was very traditional classics education. And you can see on this chart of the 7 liberal arts, that same kind of woman that is ecclesia, but in this case is identified as philosophia, which arguably also could be Menuhine, who is the goddess of the muses, but also of memory. And I think it's really fascinating that memory is at the heart of all of those disciplines in ancient Greece, and how that kind of is transmortified and muted, like through all these different cultures, and people think of it and visualize it in different ways. And so this, of course, was created by Herod von Landsberg, who was a abbess, and she worked in a nunnery, and this was a collaborative effort between her and a bunch of other nuns to educate folks as they came through. And because I thought Donna Haraway would like it, I threw in an image of the sanctuary that they would have worshipped at on the hill in France here. Because I also liked how she decided that to include these like plants coming in as part of her landscape to like identify where they are from. But I just wanted to point out on the right, you have rhetoric with that wax tablet, that memory tablet. In this case, it looks more like canon tables, less like a grid. And then this is grammar holding a whip, because that was the only way to instill grammar in young people at the time. And then also, I think important to note that it wasn't necessarily this great radical thing that there are these women, right? They're still being kind of objectified, and there are these holy beings that are representing these concepts, because they weren't allowed to do as much in real life. But of course, also embedded in this image are the poets and magicians at the bottom, who are inspired by the unclean spirits. So there's a bit of propaganda within these manuscripts as well, which comes to a head in this depiction of hell, where on the left you can see Jewish people being burned in a pot, and on the right the clergy, because Herod of Landsberg was a reformist. So she had very specific violent opinions that this encyclopedia also reinforced. And so when I think about the comic grid, I'm not just thinking about the shape, that very specific grid. I'm also thinking about all that is sort of embedded in this way of telling stories in this linear tradition. And so here, the comic grid is imbued with this history. I think it's important to remember that comics are built to be remembered, but that's both a dangerous thing and a really amazing thing, right? It can be very easy to communicate through a comic, but it can also, if you say the wrong thing, could infect a population. And so I keep that in the back of my head. This is an illustration that I did for my alma mater, St. John's College, where I was before I came to UB. And these are all the books I read. So I similarly kind of think of these as this sort of Western thought, this grid. And one thing to note is just the lack, they've been working on it, but there's still like a complete lack of diversity in the texts. We read like 3 women and like 2 people of color through the whole program. And that's obviously an issue. So I'm thinking a lot right now about what that has meant for me and how my entire practice has sort of been an effort to try to correct that. It started here at UB. My thesis show was the Museum of Failure, which was like pointing out all these failures of dead white guys. So that's Nietzsche going mad in the town square in the middle left there. There was also Franz Reichelt jumping off the Eiffel Tower in a flying suit of his own invention and leaving a 15-centimeter dent upon impact. There was this little video of that from a newsreel, and there was a Library of Alexandria going up in flames. This was a different iteration that I did at the University of Rochester Hartnett Gallery. And then you can see in the back, there's like a tapestry that I embroidered that'll come back in a minute. Marc Roget, who created the first thesaurus, but also like sort of had his personal life dissolve around him as he tried to organize the language. That was the first comic that I made. And then, as Isabel mentioned, I started sending these out at first every month when I was a student here, and then every other month after I graduated. And this was a way to just like keep exploring these stories, and it kind of encapsulated every project starts as a postal constituent. So this was a show I had at the Western New York Book Arts Center downtown, where I sort of had a retrospective of 10 years of that. And you can also see that tapestry more up close of failure, just referencing different moments in history, kind of inspired by the Baya tapestry, which is famous historic tapestry. But at the same time, like as I was starting to teach at an all-girls school here in Buffalo, I started to question what I was doing. Like, why was I just spending all my time poking fun of a group that I wasn't even really a part of? So I just wonder about the efficacy of devoting all my creative energy to the failures of dead white men. And so that was sort of percolating in my head as I continued to care for my students, perhaps more than I could care for myself, because I was like, well, I feel pretty weird just teaching these male artists. So I was making like a real effort to change what I was teaching. And I find that that often is the case. It's like easier to do things for others than for yourself. And then at the same time, I had started to submit cartoons to the New Yorker. So, which requires you to submit hundreds and hundreds of cartoons. They take 5 to 10 submissions from people every week. And so they get thousands of cartoons every week. And so I just got used to rejection. This is one of the first cartoons I submitted. This is actually number 16. I've submitted over 800, currently kind of on a hiatus. I burnt out a little on it, to be honest, and I'm also starting to think of it as part of that grid. I think I'll return to it at someday, but it's like this establishment, like it's the thing that like made people pay attention to what I was doing, which I feel complicated about, which y'all probably have experienced to some degree somewhere in your lives. But at least we live full lives. This is the hamburger camper. I always really liked this one. And then this is the first one I sold, or the first one that went to print. I sold one before this. Now we're leaving the hall of stuff we stole from other cultures and entering the hall of stuff we paid too much for. So this was like a direct reference to experiences taking students to art galleries in Buffalo. And when I could make some sort of anti-colonial statement in the cartoons, that was really awesome and felt good, but sometimes they weren't quite as nuanced. I like this. What bothers me most is the implication that real boys have some keen sense of objective truth. I like this one, you know, Pinocchio. And then I know I should have gotten a cart, but I can't give up now. So this happened to me all the time when I go to the grocery store. But you know, some of them are a little lighter. So 70 degrees in spring, 70 degrees in fall. I wanted to share them because I think it's an important part of my work, but because it's such a structure that exists outside of me, it doesn't feel as pregnant for invention, I guess. And I think maybe I'll return to them at some point. So this next section is about circles. So I'm going to start with the Catawba map. So this is a deerskin. It's a copy of an original deerskin map that was presented to Francis Nicholson, who was the colonial governor of South Carolina by the Nassau people in 1721. And I just love how these indigenous tribes are featured by the circles. And of course, the colonists are featured by these rectangles and squares on the sides. And that just like really lit up my imagination about the difference between, harsh angular geometry and circles. And so I started making this. This is something I made recently that uses the circles instead of a grid. And what I liked about it is I noticed there was room for non-human life in the space between the circles. And I started looking at these old alchemical hermetic philosopher images. They really thought that they could embed images with these complex ideas. And that was fascinating to me. And I'm going to talk more about the frogs and the mockingbirds later. But this notion of learning what it means to be a circle outside of that square. So I also did that after the Vitruvian Man, where like she just flips her arms up and somehow is now a circle instead of a square. I'm thinking about what that means as a metaphor, and finding it all over the place as I do historical research. So this is a book that I really loved that pushes the boundary of what academic history can be. It's called Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, and it is about Black women in Philadelphia and in New York during the Gilded Age, and about how they sort of used their lives to assert their freedom, kind of against all odds, like in being sent to reform institutions that were like, glorified prisons that they weren't given a fair trial when they were sent there for just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, being at a party, having sexually experimental lives, and they would be punished. And so, but the way that she tells this story is she has to fill in the gap in the archive. And she does that by not using traditional citations, but instead of like quoting directly, but putting it in italics a lot of times to almost become a chorus across time from a bunch of amazing Black thinkers, so that all of these people are like behind these figures that we don't know anything about. So she uses like the web of that group in order to tell a story that is mostly lost. But she also does very meticulous archival research to support that. But she uses the same metaphor. The story is told from inside the circle. So I think of that Catawba map. I think of those circles. And what does it mean to tell a story from the inside a circle instead of from outside in the grid looking at the circle? And I don't think it fully achieved it, but Suffrage Song was some kind of attempt to try to do that, but also to be cognizant of all the circles, right? So this book dealt with racism within the suffrage movement. It began as these zines that I was doing in collaboration with the Birchfield Penny. I started doing these comics for the suffrage centennial, which was 1920, it was 2019. And so the Birchfield Penny curator subscribed to my comic and had seen that comic that I made, like sort of rethinking what I was doing and whether I still wanted to make fun of dead white guys. And so he reached out, and I started this project because of that. It covers this long period, so it rethinks the periodization of suffrage history to include the civil rights movement. So 1848 till 1965. It also has, and this doesn't work, I don't think. Yeah, that's okay. But it has fold outs. So this is a map that folds out twice into a big map. There are 4 of those fold outs. I wanted it to feel like you were looking through an archive, like you were piecing together a history. So to that end, I did things like make etchings inspired by, so this is at Women's Studio Workshop, which is a residency, a printmaking workshop in upstate New York. And you can see that I was trying to emulate, this would have technically been a lithograph, the style of Godey's Lady Book, which was responsible, I think, for like perpetuating a lot of the stereotypes of women during this era, and specifically never mentioning the Civil War, even though like it was taking the lives of like most of the readership's families. So maybe we should end slavery. Radicalism is unbecoming of a lady. 50,000 men died at Gettysburg, and our dresses keep getting more amazing. Which was just how it was, and this was women's sphere, and like, but how do you navigate that? Like really trying to think through the material, again, thinking about what knots, not knots, like trying to emulate the styles that people were thinking through in the time. And I sent this mock-up of the book to a publisher, Fantagraphics, which was like a dream publisher of mine, and they were interested in it. And this is how I convinced them to do all of the fold-outs, is because I made this art object book and I sent it to them. It was really important for me to make it feel handmade, because feminist history is handmade. I went to this Women's Hall of Fame in Seneca Falls, and that was one of the things that really struck me, is just how every women's story was just like hand done on a piece of foam core. Like you could see the hand. It is not like this, right? It is not this sterile piece of public sculpture that was put in a white real estate development in Richmond, Virginia, at the time, and helped encourage a spike in lynching during the Jim Crow era, right? Like it was not that. It was more like this, more like the handmade destruction of this. There was evidence of people involved. And I'm thinking a lot about how you leave room for ghosts when you write history. These ghosts for me in the book, because they do come through. That's why it's the haunted history. They embody the anxiety of existing in a broken system. They represent a history that still needs to be reckoned with and a history that remains unwritten. And it was really anxiety inducing to create this project because sometimes I just had so much anxiety about trying to do this story justice. But I think the thing that was the most helpful to me was just this feeling that I was engaging in a useful process that other people could benefit from because they might want to engage in it themselves. And I might say the wrong thing, but if I just kept going, I might figure out how to say it better. Right. So somebody who particularly upset me as I was working on this was Carrie Chapman Catt, because she really would say whatever racist thing it took to get white women the vote. And of course, I also realized something I didn't put in the book is that she actually lived with a woman her whole life. She was queer. But it was complicated to me to kind of realize that and tell that story alongside the fact that she was racist, because I didn't want the most racist character in my book to also be the only queer character in my book. But how often this happens, because people project their own issues onto others, right? And if you don't resolve your own issues, then you are more susceptible to just sort of succumbing to a surface level ideology that's dangerous. And so this is me being haunted by Carrie Chapman Catt in the 2020 election. Really thinking through this whole time about what it means to reckon with history and slavery's legacy. This is Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote the book Caste. She's saying whatever is lurking will fester, whether you choose to look or not. Which all of this echoes differently and weirdly in my life now, which I'll be talking about in a bit. But I think it's interesting to remember that Germany was forced to reckon with the Holocaust. They pay reparations to survivors, and they've incorporated that history into school curriculums. But here, teaching the history of racism remains controversial. The wound has festered, and old themes endure. So one of the most important things about working on that book for me was just realizing that the more I worked and the more research I did, the more I saw how interconnected the struggles of all disenfranchised groups were. I think Frances Watkins Harper put it best in 1866. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest of its members without receiving a curse in its own soul. So that was a big message of the project for me. But the ghosts also emerged in the book because of the connection between spiritualism and suffrage. So because spiritualism really swept the nation after the Civil War because so much of the population died. It really did touch almost everyone in the country. And so they started summoning the dead. And this was an early public forum for women. They were allowed to channel their dead family members and white men. It was okay for them to do that in public, while it was not okay for them to speak on other issues. And it turns out Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, one of the first place women asked for the vote, on a spiritualist table. And there's letters of her talking about that experience of channeling the spirit of the revolution to write this declaration. I had a really magical moment after the book came out where I got to go see this table. Of course, it did not note that it was a spiritualist or a seance table, that it had been used that way, but this is at the National Museum of American History. They also had my book in the gift shop downstairs, so that was a really cute moment for me. But so this is just an example of how I used to do the research, which was chaotic and exhausting, but you can see some of the image references in there. And as I worked on it, one of the things that really struck me the most was the way that the history of women's suffrage was written by the people who were involved in the movement. If they hadn't written it, it would not have been archived, right? So they had to do this. But as a result, their story, the people who wrote its story, really came forward. So this is Matilda Jocelyn Gage, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And Matilda Jocelyn Gage is critiquing the fact that they are responsible for it. Most of it is their story. And one of the errors they made that they reproduced Sojourner Truth's speech, Ain't I a Woman, in the Southern slave vernacular that it had been published in the newspaper in, even though Sojourner Truth spoke in a Dutch accent. And so this was a comic where I kind of explicate that. And then here we have another gap in the history that I tried to address, which is Mary Church Terrell. We know that she marched with the National Women's Party at the White House gates. We know that because she wrote about it in her autobiography. But there were a bunch of other Black women that picketed, and their names were not recorded, because if they had been recorded in the literature of the day, it would have cost a lot of support for the movement from racist white women. So I have a short bit to read here on that topic. But what does it mean to be lost to history? Loss suggests passivity, but history is active. In 1921, Mary Church Terrell asked the NWP to pressure Congress to investigate the disenfranchisement of Black women across the South. No woman in this country needs the ballot more than the colored women of the South. History is made, written, edited. There is more than one to write. Terrell's words were not recorded in the stenographer's report, and they were left out of the published meeting minutes. They are victims of lynchings, the conflict lease system, the Jim Crow lines. Just as every choice erases possibility, each history written leaves behind casualties. The National Women's Party refused to help. Is it possible to write history that leaves room for their ghosts? Miss Paul did not want to inject the race problem into her suffrage work. Ghosts to show us what could have been, could be, if our systems made it be. Alice Paul asked me, what do you women want me to do? Ghosts to suggest new systems, new ways of being. I said, I want you to tell us whether you endorse the enforcement of the 19th Amendment for all women. History that breathes, that lives, that creates possibility. Paul refused to help. She feared losing the ground many women had gained with the 19th Amendment. Universal suffrage didn't work for Aunt Susan. Why would it work for us? History that refuses to accept a broken system as the only system. Alice Paul had a chance to reject racism. What if she had taken it? So the project really does attempt to ask those questions, but also not suppose that there's like an easy answer. So that the reader can kind of sit with it and just contemplate that and stay in that ambiguous space, which I think is necessary to be a critically thinking human, engaged citizen in the world. And this was the installation at the Birchfield Penny, bringing that story into physical space through artifacts. At the center, there's this small diorama of Susan B. Anthony being confronted by the ghosts of some civil rights activists on her deathbed, which was like a reimagining of a story that was actually published and told about Susan B. Anthony being confronted by all of her colleagues in the suffrage movement on her deathbed, having never actually been able to legally vote in her life. And I also made this long panorama, kind of doing a spin on another historical item you might find in an old history museum on a smaller scale that summarized the story and kind of highlighted some key moments. And you can also see some of the booklets there on embedded into the panorama itself. And then here's another image for scale. And this book did win the Eisner, which was pretty cool. So there's a big comics con in San Diego every year, and there's these awards. And so the book won, and that felt really amazing, especially because I think it's a culture of escapism, but a lot of the books that won this year were not. Just fantastical stories. A lot of them were critically engaged, and I was honored to be one of them. And so the next category is webs. So as I'm thinking about Donna Haraway, I'm thinking about the natural world and trying to get beyond the human created systems. And one really fascinating structure is the spider web. And spiders, there are some scientists now who believe that spiders' brains are partially in their webs. The idea is that they think with their web, their brains are pea-sized, but somehow, because they have their web as a tool, they can use it as an extended way to know information about like what is where in their web, to do things that it seems like they shouldn't have the capacity to do. And I like that as a metaphor. I'm thinking about it a lot, like what's around us, how our context matters in the stories we tell, and how our context matters and how we make meaning. And this is something that historians of the environment are thinking about a lot. So this is a book I read this summer called People of the Ecotone, about folks that lived in the sort of Midwestern region, like between a lot of the main center areas, like in Illinois and in Iowa, and the Meskwaki people were among them, and how they related to the history of buffalo as an animal and the history of the land as an animal, and how those histories impact the economic history, and how the colonist history impacts the different indigenous groups. And you have to think about the ecosystem, the web, more than you think about this one isolated history, which really doesn't exist. That only exists because of power. And so I'm thinking about how I developed as an artist, both here at UB and elsewhere. And I just want to say that when I was a grad student, we were coming at a very specific historical moment where the financial crisis had just happened. So there were a lot of returning students. We went to Occupy Wall Street. We had this goofy dance troupe called Saving Us from Destruction, where we would each make up a dance move, and then record the dance. And we started doing that in public spaces, including at Occupy Wall Street. We were also involved in a lot of these art parties that used to go on in Omaha. So this was at Peep Show. Someone did a gender bending wheel where you would get a mustache or a beard drawn onto you. I was in a class with Tony Conrad in media studies that was we would just go to New York and do stuff in New York, and he let us sleep on the studio floor, and sort of underlining the importance of that community. Here's just me with a couple of my other art cohort, two awesome painters. And then after I graduated, we all stuck around. And so this is me with artist Kyle Butler and a couple other artists in town, with some of my friends in foreground, Shasti O'Leary Student Project at Nuit Blanche. So we were always sort of helping each other with each other's art, and sort of, I think, informing each other's work. And then bringing that to the students. This is actually Dave Sherm, who used to teach painting here, his show. And I brought my high school students to see that show, and just thinking about how these communities really impact how we think about our art. And so that's one way I'm thinking about webs. I'm thinking about community. But I think it's always been present in the gaps and the associations I make in my work. So this was a performance I did at Squeaky Wheel's Peep Show in 2012. It was called Tabula Emphaticus. The artist finds an excuse to talk to people she normally would not talk to about things we normally do not talk about. And it was the ideas I would engage in these conversations with strangers about ideas and things. And the ideas were things like meta-narrative, and the things were things like a funnel or a marble. And we would try to have a conversation connecting the two things, creating these webs over something ostensibly nonsensical and trying to create meaning together. And this was also in different iterations of the museum. But all of my work was always about all of the things together and never just one of them. I hate showing something isolated by itself. And so there's this web-like quality to a lot of my work. This was called How to Fly in America, and it used satirical imagery from old political cartoons of the Gilded Age of rich people wearing money bags, and it put it next to this was supposed to be the house of poor people who were 6 inches tall. And so that was this running joke, and there were all these constructed artifacts, and then this was supposed to be a real house. But then I was also making these emergency shanties that sort of I think are imbued with that fear of the precarity of our lives that are increasingly precarious because of climate change and just polycrisis across the board. This exhibition, I actually hung my work. It was next to Joan Linder's work at Hall Walls, which was really cool because she had New York Times that were So I'm just like thinking a lot about how you like learn from others, right? And how maybe even unconsciously sometimes that happens. So when I moved out to Omaha, it was really important for me to try to construct that web, to find those communities. And so I joined this artist working group, run by this organization called Amplify Art. And started going on walks with people and talking to them about hope and what hope meant to them, which is just like, so just kind of sweet and, eager, like, cause I was suddenly in the Midwest. I was feeling very eager and, I don't know. Anyway, so I went on this walk with Peter. He showed me this bur oak and he said it gave him hope because, bur oaks have this thick, corky bark that enables them to survive intense wildfires. This tree has its own city lot. Something will survive. It just might not be human, right? So like rethinking your context. So sure, climate change is very overwhelming and depressing if you just think about human species, but there's going to be some stuff that survives. Another conversation I had was just about like how, sometimes how communication breaks down and systems built to work in symphony drop their branches and become obelisks. You try to be good, but before you know it, you're absentmindedly plucking up the grass, which is something I really felt like there's no way to kind of escape that. I had a friend who was just like growing plants in his yard, and he was talking about, as long as you don't expand your context too far, you can feel okay. It like rooted in one very specific place. The more things begin to seem impossible, the more that happens when you expand your context. But if you care for something small in here, you stop floating out into the ether. I went on a walk across the river to Iowa, where they have this line in the middle of the river, that is supposed to show the border between the states, but it's like there's a fluid body, right? So how do you divide a fluid body? If you keep drawing the line, you start to believe it. And so Lee was a sculptor in Omaha, and I found her, and then I found this crit group, and a lot of them are writers. One's a book artist, and Lee's a sculptor. And that has been so key in my thinking lately. So I just wanted to mention that. I am currently working on this project that starts to look at the knot we knot knots with, which is for me largely disasters. I've been kind of preoccupied with disasters lately, and I'm thinking about how thinking about disasters all the time impacts the way you engage with the world. And one of the sort of pregnant symbols I found of this are these postcards of oil well fires, which people sent a lot during the late 1800s and early 1900s, because this was the cheapest way to communicate. And so I started just collecting these, seeing what they were, what was written on the back of them. But like just hanging them in my house as if they were supposed to like remind me of catastrophe. But like, what does that do? So this comic is kind of me interrogating that. It's also, I'm starting to engage with the history of ecofeminism and looking at Carolyn Merchant's work, which is about, women as resources, how the rise of sexism, slavery, and colonialism relate to this shift towards nature as a dead thing, there to be mined as resources. And so this is like what I was reading when Trump got elected over Harris. And so that's like really potent in my head. And then I'm also looking at other visual culture from different time periods. So these are women eating babies during famine that was caused by a mini ice age that happened during the medieval era, during the plague era, like right before the plague. And they were blamed for causing the famine and like making it continue because they were eating the babies, which is interesting, the way that certain groups are oppressed more during times of disaster. And as a child, I played disaster victims in the cemetery walk, like as a historic tour, and I would like reenact that. And so the comic sort of deals with my own personal narrative as like an art, like as a way of centering my bias, and then it goes through the history, like acknowledging that bias throughout. We're at 55 minutes. I have this video that I was going to share that kind of gives you an overview of the project, but I'm thinking maybe I should just open it up to questions. Yeah. So,
How long is the video?
it's 13 minutes. It's kind of long. Yeah. I mean, I could play a little snippet of it, maybe.
Play a snippet.
Okay. All right. It starts pretty intense, but we'll just play the beginning.
First, you should know I live alone now. I'm experiencing what most people might call a midlife crisis. I've been following symbols, the frogs and the birds. I followed them into a divorce. I've been reading history books and staring out the window, making connections. Since I started following frogs, I've been finding them everywhere, including beneath this passage written in 1981 by Enestra King about ecofeminism, the need to connect theory and practice, the spiritual and the material, being and knowing. I had a dream that the fluffy cat transformed into a Sphinx cat in my lap, dropping grubs all over me, and the grubs just sort of burrowed halfway into my skin and then flapped there. When I was growing up, there was a Sphinx cat that roamed my neighborhood, and we were all very afraid of it because it was kind of mean. But Mrs. McMahon liked it, though. Did it help that she liked weird things? Because the thing is, I lived in this fairly affluent suburb outside Chicago, and there were certain things we just didn't talk about. But for some reason, I had weird interests, and my fascination with disasters began early. Suddenly, there was a total panic. People started clawing at each other like wild animals, trying to escape from the blazing inferno. At 7, I played an Iroquois theater fire victim in our local cemetery walk. I saw Anna fall, and people stepped right on top of her as they fought their way to the exit doors, but these doors opened inward. With so many hundreds of people fighting and clawing to get out, many of us ended up in huge piles right in front of the exits. Not long after I played my first disaster victim, I became convinced that I was dying of a rare disease that the doctors would never understand. God bless Mom and Dad and Courtney and McMahon's, and please make me not die. I started sleeping with my head by the open window, even when it was chilly. Cocooning against the cold gave me comfort. I think I saw something about the fresh air cure and on a historic home tour. Plus, obviously, the open window made me closer to heaven. And if I do have to die, please make it after the sleepover on Saturday. And the thing was, between my yard and McMahon's yard, we really did live out an idyllic childhood. And yet disaster worked. I just knew. I knew because Annie was an orphan, and we played orphans all the time. It's a hard knock life for us. Instead of treated, we get tricked. I knew because loggers tried to destroy Fern Gully. I knew because Timothy from The Secret of Nim got pneumonia at the worst possible time. I don't want to be Timothy. I want to play Mrs. Brisby. But most of all, I knew because I had a secret. It hurt when I had to pee, and doctors didn't know why. The pediatrician thought the pain was probably in my head. We could try the children's hospital if I wanted to. I thought about it, but I didn't want to make everybody uncomfortable. And it seemed like I was really weirding everyone out. It seemed like they all preferred to pretend that my pain wasn't there, and so I pretended. I figured it would go away on its own, like headaches sometimes did. I don't want to push you, Kate. You decide for me, though. Falling asleep, I tried to convince myself that the pain had passed, but then I'd wake up with that now familiar burning sensation and need to rush to the bathroom for relief. Back in bed, I'd toss and turn, considering how I might will the pain to stop or make a potion to banish it. At least a year passed before I gained the courage to act
to go back to the doctor. So then it kind of gets into midwifery, and also how the witches were identified by marks on their labia majora, which is kind of wild, and how that feeling kind of related to how weird and othered I felt because of this, and because medical
This was
sexism.
so awkward.
And then it kind of gets into my engagement with the history of science in school, and just thinking about like, well, you know, oftentimes our comments about sexism when I was in school were sort of minimized as tangential to the real matter at hand. So it's talking about, well, but how does this actually impact meaning? Doesn't it matter? Like, doesn't it sort of like nullify all of the things that they conclude? If this is sort of a basis and a foundation for it, doesn't it impact the overall meaning? And so that's like the big overarching question that I'm still asking as I kind of like confront some stuff about my own queer identity and sort of go through my own personal archive, like looking for signs of things that I had suppressed for a really long time. And so it deals with just these feelings of discovering yourself as you discover the historical archive, and just like seeing connections between the way we repress about climate and the way that we repress our own personal lives. And then it just kind of ends with this moment here, and then we'll open it up to questions.
And maybe it would have helped us begin to see that we don't exist outside of a network of relations, because action at a distance is real, and we are all entangled. And did you know that you emit light when you look?
Which we're bioluminescent on like a level you can't see. So we are all right now emitting a small amount of light, which is kind of wild. And the idea is that if you are exerting your attention somewhere, your brain is more active. So you might be emitting just a little bit more light, which is actually an old debunked theory of like about how you see, but they're realizing there might be a little bit of truth to it. So there's my talk. Thank you all. I'd love some questions.
Open for questions, everyone. Who wants to start it off? Is the film available in one?
It will be. So I did this for a ubART reading series, and they haven't posted it yet, but it will be online soon. Mm-hmm. So I'll post it on my social media when they post it. Any other questions? Yes.
So you taught at different levels, from high school and then the university. To what degree are connections in terms of inspiration for your work, or how that's impacted the work, as it's called, across the spectrum?
Oh, like how was it different to teach high school versus how, like, well, so first I would just say, I think student work impacts me indirectly all the time. Like, I notice my students kind of like getting into the same river as I'm in, and me getting into the same river, like that happened. I think that's just like natural in any creative community. But I guess on a different level, I would say just like when I taught high school, I couldn't dive really deep with the research. I had to stay on the surface because it was just I was teaching 5-6 classes at a time, and it was just like, you just had to tread water, right? So now I have all this time. I'm like working on a second master's degree. I'm like diving really deep with the research. I feel like it's kind of amazing. I love teaching high school, but it was brutal. It was a lot of work. Other questions? Yeah, Stephanie.
Hi, Caitlin.
Hi.
That was a really great talk.
Thank you.
So fun to see what you did when you were here, and see all those pictures, and to see all the great stuff you're doing now. My question is, you use irony a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess I'm curious how you situate it, like, because you're dealing with all of these really sensitive issues, whether they're historical or they're personal.
Mm-hmm.
But you always kind of do it in a way that's kind of ironic, and you use humor, but it seems like it's always, is it like a tactic to make things more accessible? Like, I'm just kind of curious as to your thinking around that.
Well, I think with the personal stuff, it's just like a survival tactic to not take myself too seriously, right? Like as long as I'm in on the joke, it's fine. And I think it makes it easier to digest too when it could feel maybe kind of self-indulgent otherwise, but also to remember that this is like, the history of these kinds of stories being minimized is huge and they actually need to be told because especially at this threshold of like, lowercase t trauma that's like hard to even acknowledge as a problem. It's really important to tell those things. And I think doing it with lighthearted humor is a way to do it, where somebody even who is like, well, your life wasn't hard, could still enjoy it, right? Because they think that I'm in on the joke of it being kind of not so intense. I feel complicated to some degree about humor, like in the New Yorker. Sometimes I think it's just like a catharsis that enables an action. So I've been thinking about that a little bit. But of course, also I know that even now in the protests, you're seeing people like dressed up in these inflatable suits, and like that makes it hard for people from, far right people to critique those protesters because they're wearing those suits, and it makes them look like they have no joy, right? So I see that it can also be used as a tactic. So I guess that doesn't really answer your question, except it just like presents new questions, but just me thinking about it. I do think about it a lot, but when I'm actually using it, I'm just doing it, Yeah. Yeah.
I know you had mentioned classics multiple times early on. How much do you know about classics? I ask as a classics major myself.
Oh, cool. Well, how much I know about it is hard to quantify. Well, it was like a book club. What was interesting about it is, and was cool is that we're actually reading text for their own sake. We weren't reading anybody else's writing about them. So the historical context I have is lacking, but I have that sense of how Plato relates to Aristotle. Like that stuff is from my own experience. So in some ways, very progressive program in that like it empowered me to have my own opinions, but in other ways, very conservative in that
it's very hard to understand the time.
Right, exactly.
Especially when you're trying to put pieces
together. That's cool that you're a classics major though. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You talk a lot, or you were talking a lot about like the community and the web, and you've lived in a lot of different places. And I've lived in Buffalo my whole life, and I've kind of like been experiencing this whole like art community like web thing, and I'm finding it like difficult thinking about like moving to a different place like in my future. And could you talk a little bit about like your experience like leaving behind like those communities and like moving on to like new communities and stuff as an artist?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Like, I don't think it's easy at all, especially if you've been somewhere for a really long time. I would say I'm still connected to those communities. I met with my colleagues from Buffalo Seminary for lunch the other day, and one of them is here. A few of my art friends from Omaha are here. I am connected and talk to the people, which is helpful to know. And then when I got there, I used because I came in to teach, I used that network, and there weren't a lot of faculty interested in making friends at first because it was the tail end of COVID. But then some of those people retired, and we hired new people who were looking for that. And I joined that art community. So looking at your local nonprofits, like seeing which ones are going to be maybe like an affinity group for you because of the types of things they say on their website. Amplify Arts has like a political and sort of social justice bent, and I could see that, and I was like, this is probably good for me. And it felt weird at first because a lot of the artists were much younger. They were straight out of undergrad. But like, having that humility to be like, I could still learn from these people, like, and that I think was really important. And just like being able to, notice similarities in unexpected places. But it's not easy. I mean, going to art events. Yeah. getting in, like trying to apply to things that exist, like using the structures that already exist, but do it because you might like have dreams about grubs burrowing into your skin and become a totally different person, right? Like that's pretty fun.
I had one. I was wondering if you could talk about process. Like, do you use pencil and paper? Do you draw digitally? All of the above?
All of
your
the
work
above.
translates digitally really well, and I was curious how.
Yeah, so this new project is mostly digitally drawn, but because it is just a little bit faster. But previously, the other book is all the ink. Silvered Song is all ink physically, or painted physically, or drawn in pencil physically. And I often change the media for different type of content. So a lot of the watercolor pages were also collages of microfiche printouts. So they're like they're local histories that emerged just out of the newspaper archives instead of like being in books that I was reading. So I try to make like a conceptual difference, but the real reason I'm doing it is because I'm just trying to keep myself engaged, you know? But then you have to like find a reason to do that too. And parts of it are just drawn in shaded pencil. Too, which became a process that even though I really loved how it looked was faster because I could quickly digitally color it just by doing an overlay instead of having to like go in and actually color the whole thing, which takes forever. So, yeah.
Any more questions for Caitlin? Am I missing it? What's your next project, or what's the?
It's this disaster weaving webs disaster imagining disaster project. Yeah. So this is the book, and it's going to be using different pieces of visual culture from across time to think about how disaster imagery has been used to against different groups of oppress people. And then it's also interrogating my own bias and sort of thinking about my own trauma and relationship and repression in relationship to like repression of polycrisis. And it's also about the history of ecofeminism. It's like too big, but I'm going to do it because I'm going to follow the web, and I'm going to let it bloom out instead of like trying to narrow, because I think that is what my body is telling me to do. And I think that is sort of the eco feminist and the environmental history way, is to think more in the ecosystem and less in the straight path. So that's the project.
In a nutshell.
Yeah. Questions? Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.